President Donald Trump's heated confrontation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the Oval Office is still making waves. The two leaders clashed over Ukraine's future, and within days, Trump made a move that shocked the world. He cut US military aid to Ukraine, effective immediately. According to Trump, the war has become a massacre, and the only way to end it is by forcing Ukraine to negotiate. But not everyone agrees with his strategy. NATO allies, particularly in Scandinavia, are taking a very different approach. And that's where Norway enters the picture, delivering a response that no one saw coming. Just one day after Trump's aid suspension, Norwegian fuel supplier Haltbakk bunkers announced that it would stop supplying fuel to the US Navy. It might sound like a minor move, but beneath the surface, this decision could have bigger implications than most realize. So why did Norway make this call, and could this be just the beginning of a growing European divide over Trump's Ukraine policy? Let's dive in. Norway, as one of the dozen founding NATO members, has been a key supplier of fuel throughout the alliance. In particular, Haltbakk bunkers and other Norwegian fuel companies have provided logistical support for all NATO vessels in and around Norwegian waters, be they military or civilian in nature. On the surface, the announcement that Haltbakk bunkers will stop supplying the US Navy with fuel is not particularly consequential for the latter, and for a few reasons. First, the announcement didn't come from the Norwegian government itself, but from the private company. To emphasize that fact, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense responded to the news by clearly stating that the mutual support between the US and Norway would continue as it was. Norway doesn't want to stop or change the mutually beneficial relationship it has built with the rest of NATO, the US included, particularly due to the fact that it's one of the few NATO countries that has the capability to extract and refine oil and gas. Still, Haltbakk bunkers emphasized its promise to stop supplying the US with fuel by reminding the world that it had previously done so with Russian clients when the invasion began back in 2022. According to the company's CEO, the fuel supplier leveraged its moral compass against its profits. As one of many Norwegian fuel companies, Haltbakk probably lost some of its 2022 revenue to its competitors due to its self-imposing bans on export and supply based on political events. But because of the company's actual scale and scope, the fuel ban is not likely going to be large enough to matter to the US Navy anyway. In the very same announcement, the supplier's CEO admitted that the boycott would likely be seen as symbolic. This is mainly due to the fact that the company didn't have a permanent contract with the US Navy in the first place. According to reports from 2024, Haltbakk provided only between 3 and 4 million liters of fuel to US ships. While this sounds like a lot, and it probably is, we need to put things into perspective. The US Navy is considered one of the world's largest fuel consumers, easily outpacing more than a few other countries. This is due to the fact that the US military has among the world's largest fleet of aircraft, ships, and arsenals of armored vehicles such as tanks and infantry support vehicles. Specifically, the US Navy operates over 400 vessels, some of which include 11 aircraft carriers, all of which are nuclear-powered, allowing for extended deployments without the need for refueling. Both attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines total approximately 70 vessels. All active submarines are nuclear-powered, providing stealth and prolonged underwater endurance. Around 81 active destroyers, which are conventionally powered, relying on petroleum-based fuels. 12 active cruisers, all of which are conventionally powered, utilizing petroleum-based fuels. Approximately 34 littoral combat service vessels, designed for operations near shorelines. These are also conventionally powered using petroleum-based fuels. Amphibious assault ships, amphibious transport docks, and dock landing ships, totaling around 32 vessels, all are conventionally powered, relying on petroleum-based fuels. Numerous support vessels such as replenishment oilers, hospital ships, and cargo ships are all conventionally powered and use petroleum-based fuels. Out of all of these, we can use the third category, destroyers, to illustrate just how fuel-hungry the US Navy is. The US destroyers are mainly Arleigh Burke-class ships, which use gas and oil-powered engines to move the ship and produce the electricity to power its systems. The US Naval Institute has actually published research on the best fuel economy of the ship depending on the exact kind and number of engines used at any given point, depending on the operating requirements. We won't go into the details of the calculation, but the Institute's findings suggest that at its best fuel efficiency, a destroyer might be able to reach a low of between 100,000 and 1 million gallons per week. If we convert that into liters, we get 378 liters per nautical mile. Using the aforementioned 4 million liters of fuel being withheld by Haltbakk bunkers, a single destroyer might be able to travel a total of around 10,500 nautical miles. This is just enough fuel to make 2 round trips from California to Hawaii, which are around 2,500 nautical miles apart. By contrast, the largest US Navy port on the Atlantic in the continental US is Naval Station Norfolk in Norfolk, Virginia, home to the world's largest naval base and the home port for the US Atlantic Fleet. The approximate distance from Naval Station Norfolk to Norway is around 3,500 nautical miles, depending on the exact route taken. Now, the estimated fuel efficiency is for a ship operating at its optimal level, meaning that it's likely that a ship will need even more fuel to make the trip to Norway. As such, the calculations mean that the supply that a single fuel company in Norway provides to the US Navy is a drop in a very large bucket compared to the Navy's yearly fuel demands. Instead, the US Navy ships that pass through the Northern Atlantic procure fuel on a per-need basis, which can come from any military fuel supplier in the country. This means that the boycott is largely perfunctory, at least so far, and is meant to create a political agenda both inside Norway and more broadly in NATO or even throughout the world. But the focus of the boycott is pretty clear. Some people are unhappy with Trump's proposed solutions, if we can call them as such, to the war in Ukraine. But let's focus a bit more on Norway for the moment. The country has long been allied with various Western nations. This is despite the country's efforts at officially remaining neutral throughout the first half of the 20th century. When it first gained independence in 1905, the country's politicians proclaimed that it would remain neutral in wars whenever possible. The world powers of the time, the British and Russian empires, Germany, as well as the US, didn't want to upset the delicate balance in Scandinavia, so they tried to stay out of the politics there and supposedly signed an agreement that ratified the new country's neutrality. Despite that, Norway actually failed to be neutral throughout both world wars. During World War I, Norway supplied fish, copper ore, nickel, and pyrite to both the British and, at least at the outset, the Germans. However, the British undercut Norway on fish prices, so Norway ended up having to export most of its fish to the Isles. But exports of metal to Germany remained, fueling the country's military-industrial complex, particularly for armored vehicles and submarines. In response, the British Empire issued an ultimatum that it would stop exporting coal to Norway if it didn't cease all trade with Germany. With much of the country's industry dependent on coal, Norway accepted the proposal. In return, Germany waged unrestricted submarine warfare against Norway, sinking several of the country's commercial ships and trading ships. Norway ended up losing over 800 ships and 3,500 sailors throughout World War I. World War II was no better for the supposedly neutral country. While it was still proclaimed to be neutral, the trade links between Norway and the UK made them de facto allies. This resulted in Germany putting pressure on not only Norway but also Sweden and Finland to sign an official non-aggression pact in the early 1930s. All three countries declined to do so. When World War II did eventually start, Germany invaded Norway in 1940 and was presented with relatively little pushback from the Allied countries. Germany would end up controlling mainland Norway for most of the war, while Norway's military followed the country's government to exile in Britain, where it operated in support of the alliance. When World War II ended, Norway abandoned the pretense of remaining neutral and was among the dozen founding members of NATO. This gave it even greater ties with the Western world. In particular, the country's access to oil and gas made it a vital exporter across Europe and even North America. Some of those resources are still used to fuel the ships and vehicles and militaries across the recipient countries. However, by the 21st century, Norway ended up being relatively unimportant in terms of global oil exports, accounting for only 2% of the world's production. Still, the country remained one of the world's largest natural gas exporters, only slightly lagging behind Russia, Qatar, and the US. During the late 1990s, while most other countries started to increase debt to stabilize their economies, Norway set up a long-term savings fund fueled by its oil and gas exports. Initially, the fund was supposed to fuel, pun intended, the country's pension plan, with a law that only 3% of the yearly fund could be transferred to the state budget and be used by the government. Over time, the oil fund grew as the country's exports remained high and its natural gas potential was yet untapped. According to Norway's Ministry of Energy, only around 40% of Norway's natural oil reserves have been tapped by 2023, and the country's government estimates that it can maintain peak production throughout the 2020s and possibly 2030s. The presence of the oil fund was a significant boon to Norway when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. By that time, Russia had largely supplanted the rest of the world as Europe's leading oil and gas exporter, in some cases accounting for 40% of the EU's gas and oil imports. In contrast, Norway was only producing about 30% of the EU's oil and gas. When the war started, one of the EU's first decisions was to cut most economic ties with Russia to prevent the latter from obtaining war funding. Over the 2 years between 2022 and 24, Russian exports of oil and gas plummeted to less than 20% of its pre-war figures. Most of Western Europe became largely independent from Russian resources, while Eastern European countries such as Moldova still maintained their link to Russia through gas pipelines. In response to fluctuating import streams from Russia and soaring prices, Norway boosted its natural gas and oil production in 2022. The EU started diversifying its emergent imports to the point where Russia constituted less than 10% of oil and gas imports, and Norway soared to around 30%. The higher natural gas prices and lower transport distances to Europe, as opposed to transatlantic trade, meant that Norway was considered one of the largest indirect profiteers from the war in Ukraine. All of this meant that the country's oil fund, which was once used as a reserve for pensions and emergency spending, could be tapped into to provide vital financial aid to Ukraine during the war. And did Norway contribute? Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre unveiled the Nansen program, which committed at least 135 billion Norwegian kroner, around $12 billion, in aid to Ukraine from 2023 to 2030. However, the country donated just 27 billion kroner in 2024, but recently committed another 35 billion to be distributed across 2025. By comparison, Denmark contributed an equivalent 27 billion Norwegian kroner last year, while Sweden has contributed around 73.2 billion kroner in support of Ukraine over the past 3 years. While these numbers might seem high, you have to remember that Norway is one of the few countries that is not extending its national debt to provide these donations. It's simply using the reserves made by exporting oil and gas. Those same reserves have undoubtedly only been boosted by the aforementioned increase in profit. The Norwegian Finance Ministry, led by Jens Stoltenberg, who was previously Secretary General of NATO from October 2014 to October 2024, recently calculated that Norway earned as much as 1.25 trillion kroner, or $117 billion, in extra income from increased exports throughout the 3 years of the war. This figure is almost equal to how much the entire European contingent of NATO has donated to Ukraine over the past 3 years combined, $130 billion, all amassed from the export profits of a single country. Norway is estimated to be only the 8th largest financial contributor in donations to Ukraine, slightly ahead of its neighbors Sweden in 9th place and Denmark in 12th place, according to the Kiel Institute's resources. However, other funding estimators, which work with similar data up to January 2025, put Norway out of the top 10 entirely. Given the discrepancy between how much Norway gained in profits from exporting during and indirectly because of the war in Ukraine, a few Scandinavian news outlets have directly confronted Norway's lack of proportionate funding, at least by comparison to other Scandinavian countries. Take, for example, Sweden, a country that doesn't even share a border with Russia, unlike Norway, and has neither the oil and gas industry of Norway nor the military-industrial complex and preparedness of Finland, the European country with the longest border with Russia, yet has donated roughly the same amount of aid. And there's another reason why its Scandinavian neighbors might give Norway a skeptical eye. Their aforementioned Finance Minister Stoltenberg, while serving as NATO Secretary General, urged NATO and its constituent countries to donate as much as possible to Ukraine, the US and Norway included. Yet when he returned to serving Norway only, the donations from the country didn't increase. This ties back into the Haltbakk bunker's supposed boycott of the US Navy. The Norwegian Ministry of Defense has sternly argued that this decision is only a single private company's decision on the subject and that Norway as a country will likely remain at a similar level of US support and mutual relations. Amidst Trump's new administration, US support for Ukraine in the coming months will likely plummet, with Kiel estimating that the US accounts for about 30% of all donations to Ukraine. With a heavy focus on military equipment and ammunition, this could be a significant blow to the latter's ability to defend itself at the same pace it did during 2024. Remember the second half of 2024? During that time, Ukraine managed to invade Kursk, taking roughly the same amount of territory in mere weeks that Russia took months to occupy in the Donbass. Russia's delayed response to the Kursk incursion and the strategic and logistical failures of bringing in North Korean troops to the region led to Ukraine still maintaining control over half of the occupied territory. This was compounded by the previous administration of former President Joe Biden allowing the use of US-donated longer-range missiles such as ATACMS to target locations on Russian soil, as well as Ukraine developing long-range kamikaze drones for the same purpose. Combined, these long-range strikes rained across the region's neighboring Russia, devastating the latter's oil refineries and military compounds. It was a continuation of the victories Ukraine scored in the previous year, partly attributable to the same donations that NATO provided. But now, those same valuable donations might get struck down by Trump's decision to withhold contributions in an attempt to force Ukraine's hand in proposed peace talks. So when we take in the entire picture, a boycott from a single fuel company towards the US military seems like a minor response. However, it could also indicate the start of a significant shift in inter-NATO relations, especially between the US and European countries. After all, the US is still the world's largest military and doesn't really need NATO's contributions to remain as such. The country outspends the next several world militaries in terms of national defense budgets combined, and even economic and military powers such as China are estimated to need more than a decade to match the US in sheer technological prowess in their militaries. In contrast, Russia directly borders 5 NATO countries in Europe and is relatively close to most of them. Most European capitals are within easy reach of long-range ballistic missiles, which Russia has confirmed they have. The Russian military even tested a long-range ballistic missile by launching it at Ukraine. The attack, which dealt minimal damage, used a previously unknown type of missile flagged to be a medium-range ballistic missile. Compared to an intercontinental ballistic missile, which has a range of over 6,000 miles, the experimental design is thought to have a range of roughly 1,500 miles. By comparison, the distance from Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave in Europe, and London, one of only 2 capitals in Europe with independent nuclear arsenals, is only 900 miles. Therefore, Russia has demonstrated that it has weapons that can readily threaten the European part of NATO without resorting to using the big guns, so to speak. If the US pulls its support for Ukraine, or worse, parts ways with the NATO alliance entirely in terms of unified defenses, NATO will be forced to scramble for another avenue to defend itself against attack. Of course, France has already proposed to extend its submarine-based nuclear deterrence to the rest of Europe. This proposal is based on the possibility of the US recalling a similar defense grid that it set up outside of Europe. Currently, the US stores some of its nuclear arsenal in Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. If more of Norway's fuel companies follow in the footsteps set out by Haltbakk bunkers, the US Navy would actually start experiencing logistical difficulties in Europe. While the US theoretically has more than enough oil refining capacity to serve its own military, it would need to transport fuel from the US to Europe on tankers. Since the tankers would use fuel themselves, this would severely cut into the country's ability to keep stocks of fuel for both internal use and exports, increasing the costs and reducing the profits from the energy industry. If the US recalculates its defense spending without receiving vital fuel exports from countries such as Norway, it might just decide that it's better off without the alliance in the first place. This situation would favor only Russia, as it would severely weaken the entire Western world, all while Ukraine would still be trying to fend off an invasion, now without vital donations to turn the tide in increasingly technology-dependent warfare. Ultimately, the recent events surrounding Trump's interactions with Ukraine have yet to actually fully impact international geopolitics. The political decisions made by independent companies may or may not translate to entire nations, but if they did, it could be the start of a possible change in world order, one that paradoxically favors none other than Russia and China. But what do you think? Will Europe overcome the tumultuous breakdown of relations between the Ukraine and the US? And will countries like Norway, which have arguably benefited greatly from the invasion, lower or increase their donations to Ukraine? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out Ukraine Can't Believe What Finland Just Did. Insane support. Or click this other video instead.